Hello, welcome to the Burda Festival podcast powered by afikra. I'm your host, Mikey Muhanna. On today's episode, we have Her Excellency Manal Ataya, the Director General of the Sharjah Museums Authority. This conversation is about museums, Sharjah's place on the cultural map in the region, and what we can expect from the Museums Authority in the decade to come. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Burda Podcast. Our special guest is Manal Ataya, who has served as the Director General of the Sharjah Museum Authority for the past decade. She oversees a team of 600 plus staff working in Sharjah's 16 museums, which cover areas of modern and contemporary Arab art, Islamic history, UAE heritage, and archaeology. Manal is a leading figure in the UAE cultural sector, dedicating her time to advocacy initiatives for accessible arts education programs that promote cross-cultural dialogue and social inclusion, as well as mentoring young women in leadership. She has sat on the board of many organizations around the world, including the Global Cultural Districts Network, the University of Sharjah's College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences, the Make-A-Wish Foundation, as well as others. She is a graduate of the Hamilton College in 2001 and Harvard University in 2004, and was awarded the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France in 2018 for her significant contributions to culture. Manal, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to ask you about your bio. I always find it funny as I read bios. I am curious what it's like to hear that back. You know, I list all these things that you're doing. Does it feel like that encapsulates what you actually do? Or do you think, no, that it never feels like that?
I think, all of us do definitely a lot more than often our bios mention. And of course, we do them with other people. This is not a one-person show, so to speak. But for me, it's a lot of people that sort of move this ship along. And you mentioned 600 plus staff. I mean, for me, it's an honor to work with a lot of wonderful people who allow us to do what we do and to continue to develop our programs, develop areas that we want to in our museums. There's so much more there, but I guess it's unnecessary to have to explain it in terms of, I just enjoy what I do. So I do what I have to do to get the job done. And that will require definitely a lot of other areas and wearing a lot of hats for sure.
Let's talk about the number that I think jumps out at me most, which is 16 museums. For listeners who may have not had the privilege of going to Sharjah, give us a little rundown of the history of those 16 museums. How did we get to 16 and why did we even start with one?
It's wonderful that we're doing this podcast today. Whenever this comes out, though, today is actually the celebration of His Highness Sheikh Sultan bin Mohammed al-Qasimi's time as a ruler in Sharjah. 50 years has passed. And, it's a wonderful day to celebrate all his achievements and all that he has done for the Emirate of Sharjah, but of course for the UAE as a whole. And one of those key areas, of course, is cultural development and the focus on arts and culture and education. And for me, working in Sharjah has been really a blessing because there was someone there who, prior to me being there, had already begun investing so much and so heavily in this sort of intellectual infrastructure, so to speak. When I arrived to work in Sharjah in 2006, there were already about 10 or 12 museums at the time. Some of them were much smaller than the ones that they are today. A lot of our museums during my tenure, we found new or built bigger buildings for them to house the collections properly, to house what was required for them. Other museums were completely built, new from scratch, so to speak. So it's been a tremendous journey, and it's been completely because of His Highness's absolutely clear and direct love and understanding for culture, for what it can do for people in terms of uniting people, in terms of giving them personal enjoyment, in terms of giving them a sense of often pride when they understand how their culture allows them to link themselves and to a past, but also to a collective community that they're around now and hopefully in the future. So there's a lot of great things that culture obviously brings to people. And he truly believed that that was important for young people and for families and for other people to enjoy. And for that reason, he collected over the years. He's also a historian and academic. So there was a lot of interest in collecting documents, archival material, and of course, objects. And as that sort of passion for collecting grew, then, there was a need to sort of house these collections. And his area of interest is very vast. It's very similar to me in that I'm very curious about a lot of things. I love a lot of different areas of interest, different topics, whether it's geology or archaeology or it's, contemporary art. So, this has been quite a few years of him building these collections for the public, for public good. And we have just, in a very sustainable way, continued to grow these museums over the last, in my tenure, 16 years so far. And of course, we look forward to future collections in the next coming years. But it's an ongoing process of ensuring that we preserve what we should, conserve collections and buildings. Very important to mention. Sometimes our collections are actual buildings themselves.
Yeah.
And then just ensure that we offer all of these beautiful collections for people to learn from. That's our key goal, is learning for our community.
What do people most misunderstand about what your job really entails? And not necessarily the day-to-day, but what does it actually entail to be the museum authority?
That's a hard question to answer, in that it as we mentioned earlier, it does require a lot of other work that may not be spelt out so clearly. And that's because, as I mentioned just now, there's so much diversity in our collection. So I guess one thing, for example, is that I have to be relatively up to date and aware, first of all, about what's actually happening, like regionally and globally in museum discourse. So there's that kind of understanding that's required. There's then the other level of trying to and be, as much as I can, an expert in so many different fields, because I'm responsible for those different areas, right? So, that's quite a lot to handle. I'm not just taking care of, for example, just an art museum or arts museums. Even within those, there's so many different subcategories, but to be involved in arts and then maritime history and then Islamic history and then archaeology, it means that I have to be really ready to learn quickly. I have to be very flexible. It's hard to move a ship with a lot of people. It requires an intense amount of mentoring and coaching and helping people along, especially when we were developing so many of these departments and developing so many of our programs and initiatives that we have now, and of course the ones to come. So there's always a continual kind of relearning and rebirth of what we're doing. And I think what people don't, or let's say what people mostly misunderstand, is they think the job is sort of often a 9 to 5, and it relatively doesn't change, like what could change in, museum management or whatever, but it's always a adventure. It's always something new. It's never the same. Absolutely not. There's always so much that goes on behind the scenes that requires us to, react quickly, to deal with issues that come up, whether you have living collections, which we do, like in our aquarium. So that's something that, has unique challenges. And then when you're also dealing with artifacts that are hundreds of years old, or in some cases, of course, thousands of years old. So, and then we do so much in terms of our community, being active in our community, and also what we do in terms of exchanges around the world, whether it's an exhibition or working on a project to bring music to otherwise silent objects in a museum display case with a university in Australia, for example. So a lot of different things are not necessarily highlighted, but we do so much in a lot of variety in a lot of areas, and we're always called upon to help and to bring about some of these changes, even in policies at that level. So there's a lot of macro and micro going on constantly in the job, and I think that's probably for me one of the biggest challenges is having to always have that bird's eye view, and then having to get very, down into a very detailed, view of particular things. Because of course, information, facts, historical facts, you can't make mistakes with those. And that's really important. And so our content and how we develop what we're putting in our museums, it requires that really detailed eye. And so I have to do that as well as look at the bigger picture.
You mentioned community a couple times, the word community. From, I guess, a two-part question. From your perspective, who is the community? What is the community? What is the core constituency for the authority? And two, can you talk a little bit about how you engage that community in a proactive way? The first example that comes to mind is the Museum Express project that you've sort of underseen. So if you could address those 2 points, I'd be really interested.
Sure. Well, first of all, yes, I use the word community, but I'm really meaning communities in terms of a more plural sense, because really within any community, you have these, within it, you have sort of other communities thriving and connected to one another in different ways. And for us, though, I can say the clear mandate from the beginning, from the get-go, from the ruler himself, was my target, or our target audience for these museums are children and our Arab families. And he said Arab families at the time specifically because he was very aware that, there wasn't a culture of museum going at the time, because there weren't a lot of museums here, first of all. And even for the few that they were, I think a lot of people perceived that they were, created for tourists, right? They were not really speaking to a local audience. And in many cases, they were correct. A lot of museums at the past, for example, were either written in one language or the other. They were definitely, let's say, targeting tourists in particular to come visit, and weren't really concerned with whether or not, young people or the community of families or people who live here were actually coming to these museums. So there had to be this sort of shift in the mindset of museums are not here just for cultural tourism. They're also they're a huge learning center, right? And they're a learning center for people and young children throughout their lifetime. So we hope that they'll be coming when they're 5, 6, 8, 10, 15, and onwards. So it's a lifelong learning process. And for us, that was our target. And we said right away, we need to focus on how we could get schools into museums. And that was not an easy feat. It sounds very simple, like you can just invite them to come, but it wasn't like that. A lot of schools here have a lot of restrictions about where students can go and how they can go and for how long. So we really had to work very hard to also, I guess, in a way, express how important the visit is and what they could learn when they're there, and what we had to provide, of course, in terms of workshops, activities, and really planned visits so that they really can get the most out of it. So that was a lot of work when we built up our education team and the resources it took to do that. And of course, to do it, like I said, in the languages that were required, especially Arabic, because actually Arabic was one of the languages that was not available in a lot of cultural centers here. Things were often written in English with no interest in the Arabic language. So that was a key component of what we did. And then, of course, we added over the years a lot more inclusiveness in terms of whether we, and we do now, of course, provide Braille or provide sign language in Arabic and in English, and in other ways in which we can make the museum more inclusive for people. And families wasn't the other target. Families, it's so many people here. We have, it's culturally, we have families are very tight knit. They tend to do things, of course, together. And usually families here, which is unlike other places in the world, are quite large, usually in number. So you're looking at least 5 people or more coming to a museum, including, let's say, the adults. So we had to start to find ways in which we could speak to that demographic, because a lot of our programs were, or let's say the conception of them initially was the idea traditionally to separate children from adults, right? But now we were like, no, we need to have programs where we're combining adults and children together in the same space. So trying to figure out also how to do that and what are the best times to do that and dates to do that. So there was a lot of, research, let's say, in development to figure that out. And we were very happy that over time, of course, we've developed a very consistent and returning group of people to the museums, and they really love our workshops, and they love to take part in it, in everything we offer, whether it's on site or off site. So it's been a great.
What was the Museums Express project, and how did that go? Because I read about it, and it seemed to be in the middle of COVID. How was that even implemented?
Well, it was actually implemented before COVID, but okay. It actually relates to what I just mentioned about being off-site. So what happened was, after we had sort of really developed a very successful, programming schedule of workshops and activities for young people and for families and for different groups, as I mentioned, to be more inclusive, there is one thing that I'm constantly looking at, which is sort of, why are we not reaching certain people, and what about this demographic? There's always a need to see why you might not be fulfilling that for someone or for some group. And one thing I had noticed after consulting with education team was that there were a lot of schools that were not coming to our museums. And when I asked why, they told me that it was because of the geographical distance, and that many schools are required to limit how long students stay in a bus. So if they have to travel for an extended period of time, then they're not allowed to do that for, I guess, health and safety reasons. So then it occurred to me that there must be a lot of schools that are not, let's say 45 minutes away from where we have some of our museums. And, we want to reach all these students. A lot of them were public schools, and we started listing them, and they turned out to be so many of them. And that's when this sort of thing came into my mind, where I said, you know what, we need to bring some kind of a museum experience to them. And how we do that, we'll figure it out. And this is, I guess, where the idea for the bus was born. We did open the bus a year before COVID, about a year and a half or so, just before COVID. In that year alone, we impacted 7,000 students with our museum visits. So that was huge for us. I didn't expect to be that successful.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, imagine 7,000 children who otherwise had never been or seen a museum, had never had a workshop, and had never or didn't know at the time some of the information we were conveying in the workshop about abstract art or about Emirati artists. This was all new to many of them, if not the majority. So it was successful for me because to see these students excited, for them to walk on the bus and see the different types of replica objects that we have, just igniting that curiosity in them, and then for them to have this time to actually be creative and do something in the workshop time. It's just so fulfilling for me. I could see how much they enjoyed it. And this was our way of bringing that idea of the museum to them, but also hopefully starting this sort of interest in those topics. And then getting them to think about how whether or maybe in the future they can, talk to their parents and say, I'd like to go to the museums on the weekend, and can we make that trip, for example? And, this was very important to me for people, of course, who reside outside city centers. And this is not uncommon around the world. There are a lot of people or demographics in particular that are not catered to because they are, away from the city center. London's a great example. London, for many years, everyone who lives in London gets to enjoy all the perks of the London, museums, but everyone outside of London, it's very difficult for them to get there. The money that it costs to travel, and then for a ticket, for example, to get into a museum or a ticket for an exhibition, it is expensive. And for us, though, and for me particularly, I want to remove all those barriers. I want to remove any financial barriers, intellectual barriers, in this case, trying to remove a geographical barrier. So it was very successful after COVID, and restrictions were, not after COVID, we're still in COVID, but after the initial restrictions, we've been reenacting the bus. It hasn't really gone to schools yet because that's not permitted at the moment, but we've been able to go to other community events. So any other events outdoors, sort of festivals or things like that, we've been asked to get involved. And so the bus has been luckily still being used, and we're still able to conduct workshops at different things. And we hope that, as restrictions begin to ease, we might be able to, start our school run again.
Amazing. So everyone loves all of their children equally, but you have 16 options. What would you say is the most underrated museum in Sharjah?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm asked always what's my favorite. And I'm like, I'm not going to answer that one because that's, even for me, honestly.
I can tell you what I think mine is, but go ahead. You tell me yours first.
I think underrated, I would probably say underrated because I think people take it at face value as being, it's just, well, now I'll reveal. It's actually, I think it's the Maritime Museum.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, that's what I was going to say.
That's crazy. Well, that's amazing that you had the same thought in your mind. It's interesting to know why you think so, because I think, maritime history is actually extremely exciting, unbelievable in so many ways, particularly if you think about it historically in terms of what maritime navigation, first of all, just the discovery of that and the ability to then travel. And then, of course, using boats for military in battles or in protection of waters, and then what that's led to over the years, and particularly in terms of this part of the world, not just for the trading part, not from just the pearling part, which is also key elements of maritime heritage of this country, but also some other Gulf countries. But that of particularly the Qawasim family, so the ruling family and their sort of maritime, power that was because of the fleet of ships that they also had, and their ability to stop people from coming into, Sharjah at different times throughout history. When you see the museum, or people think of a maritime museum, they think it's just a bunch of nice boats, and I don't think they take it any further than that. And it's actually to me, it's very exciting when you think about not only shipbuilding and the engineering of ships, but also this whole aspect I mentioned about how if you couldn't mobilize through ships and through the waters at certain times through history, imagine how much of our history would be different.
Yeah. It's, I loved it because, I care about aesthetics and culture and art and literature and all these things, but I love economics and how economics really help shape human society. And so the Maritime Museum was just such a beautiful, compelling, rich glimpse into how the economics of the time really crafted and shaped society at the time.
Exactly.
It's really, really well done. The aquarium is also extremely heartwarming and surprisingly impressive. I wasn't sure that it would keep on unfolding the way it did. So I really appreciated that as well.
Thank you.
I guess I want to move on to talking about the Burda Festival, which you attended, and you were a part of a panel that was entitled City Life, the Transformation of Islamic Spaces. And the whole purpose of this festival is to explore Islamic arts and culture in its many forms and in its many locations. So insofar as you are charged with thinking about all these different spaces and all these different communities and how they interact with culture and education, can you give us a sense of what you thought of what your experience was like at the festival? Who did you meet? What sort of surprised you? Maybe some lasting impressions from that panel itself.
Well, first of all, Bordeaux Festival is a great event and a great opportunity for people to come together to talk about all of these sort of issues meaning good and challenging. Let's say today when it comes to the term Islamic world, the term Islamic heritage and everything else. There's a lot there. I think we all can agree that, there's been times the Islamic world has been boxed in a certain way, and other times, especially now, we're realizing how much more, creeps into so many different areas, and it's a lot bigger than we think, and doesn't necessarily always fulfill what we imagine to be Islamic, so to speak. So I think this sort of opening of this conversation, which is what Burda, aspires to do by bringing together people from different parts of, again, in quotations, the Islamic world, and having them talk about some of this is really important. I think it's really needed. It's still something I'm very uncomfortable about when I talk about the Islamic world. It's like, how do you exactly explain it sometimes? And to me, it's usually, for me, the easiest way is just looking at it from a historical perspective. And then I can sometimes say, okay, well, Islamic world or civilization is really this period, from this period, or et cetera. That somewhat helps. But, Burda, as you know, looks at historical, but then, of course, a lot of the contemporary. And I think that's an important aspect of how we should all be viewing so much of what we are doing today, is by how our history has shaped where we are at this moment. And the talk that I was on was a really interesting look at this idea of the transformation of spaces and what are Islamic spaces. And that's something, we tried to, in a way, unpack during the discussion. And it's still a very, it's something to really still challenge and still try to continue to poke at when people have this. When we say Islamic space, I know almost automatically what people are thinking. And that was something that I brought up in the talk, which is that Islamic space is always automatically thought of as a mosque. And when it's thought of as a mosque, it's always thought of also in a very particular way with its design. And it's, I think, fascinating for a lot of people to realize that what we see as more common design for these buildings is not, it's a type. It's actually a style type that has been liked, adopted, and used. It's not necessary for the actual design of a mosque. And I think when people start seeing other types of design looks for mosques around the world, when people start to see how contemporary architectural, our architects are designing mosques, and then, of course, thinking of the broader idea of what an Islamic space can be, whether that's a university space or a center or a garden. I mean, there's so many. And I think what I took away, which was interesting from a lot of the comments of that talk, was just that people were appreciated that, first of all, that I tried to really push and highlight this idea of thinking about spaces from functional, from what it functions as versus what it looks like as, stylistically or aesthetically, and that so much of what we try to do often, doesn't combine both, and we need to do that more. And that often architects do not, or people designing buildings don't often or rarely actually really think about how the place might be used by the actual people, the users, and the community itself. And I think that's something that we need to do so much more effort. We need to work so much more on that and put a lot more effort into demanding that, really, from people that design spaces like that. I'm sure Mikey, there's so many spaces, whether Islamic or not, that you sometimes go to and you're thinking, how did someone design this? I mean, did they know people sit here, for example, or did they know people come here for lunch? Or didn't they know that people, would find this, for example, either difficult to get to or whatever it might be? And it's sometimes so obvious, and you think to yourself, did the person even hang around here long enough to really see what it looked like during the day, during the night? How it was used on a weekday as opposed to a weekend. I mean, these are really important aspects, and I think pushing that was very important. And I think a lot of people appreciated that, because I think they've seen a lot of bad design, and I think they've seen a lot of this cookie cutter idea of Islamic design, which is a lot of this geometry and stuff. And just let's add that as an add-on to a building, and then it suddenly looks Islamic, which is wonderful. And it's like, no, it doesn't. And even Islamic geometry has a lot of very specifics in terms of, how the line should be and how they meet. And if that's off, then you don't have actually proper Islamic geometry. And most buildings I drive around sometimes and see, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is completely, this is terrible. But it just shows you like, it's just something that isn't studied well or isn't really thought through. And I think, there's some really great examples of great design here and other places, and there's some that isn't. And I think, we're always constantly trying to figure out how we can improve that. And so I enjoy talking about that and listening to other people from different parts of the world, discussing how they look at space, sometimes from a much broader perspective, not just a building, but like a city, and how that has either transformed or stayed the same. So it's quite unique. And I just mentioned Sharjah's interest in the idea of Islamic design and certain patterns that, yes, are very evident in a lot of Sharjah's, urban fabric. The design of a lot of the buildings are relatively similar because there is this love for certain Islamic motifs, Islamic stylistic looks. But I mean, it's something that I just wanted to draw attention to, that it doesn't always have to be like that. And it's okay to also experiment and get out of, that kind of perceived box, right? For a lot of young people, they feel like they have to stick in it. And I'm saying, no, you don't have to, but just do it well. When you do decide to leave the box, just make sure you do it well.
Well, let's try to end on a final question, which is more perspective. So I asked you, when I introduced you, I said you've been in your position for 10 years. If you were to imagine where the Sharjah Museum Authority is in another 10 years, so imagine we're doing a follow-up interview, it's 2032. What does the organization look like? What do you hope Sharjah sort of looks like, both locally, regionally, and globally? And what are some of the aspirations that you have for your own work?
Wow. Well, so I've been working in the museum's authority for 16 years now. So it's been a long journey so far. It's been a really wonderful one. And I would imagine in the next 10 years that not much will change on that front. I think I will continue to enjoy, if I'm still here doing what I love to do, I will continue to learn and continue to adapt and change and try to bring in and refresh as much as possible what we're doing and how we're thinking about things. I don't have any issues with realizing or saying I'm wrong and saying that sometimes, something we did before probably isn't okay anymore and we should change it. So I love evolution. I think it's a healthy thing. And I'm always up for that. And I think from what I see and, in today, there's certain things that I think really need to change. And one of them definitely is inclusion. And it's why I'm very passionate about it. I think there's definitely not enough of it. I think inclusion is still looked at from a very narrow perspective. And there's so much more we can do to be really inclusive in many.
Manal, can you help me with that? So help broaden my view. So what are some of the narrow ways that I may be thinking about inclusion, and help me broaden it a little bit?
Well, like, for example, I think sometimes inclusion, or let's say access or accessibility, can be looked at from either maybe just from the point of a physical access, right? That's often how it's looked at. Like, what can we do for people who, cannot physically access because they're in a wheelchair or they have something like that. And it's like, it's so much more than them being able to physically get around. This is talking about inclusivity from a point of view of also, as I think I mentioned earlier, like financial inclusivity, right? How do you get to, or bring in people who do not make as much money as the average person, right? They're lower income, for example, family, et cetera. So making museums free, or making them low in terms of price to get in, or making there possible a lot of free days during the year, allows you to tap into and be inclusive to people who otherwise would feel that there's this barrier for them to enter. Intellectual inclusivity is another one. I think there's a lot of, and you might know this too from maybe a lot of exhibitions you've gone to, especially those that are often about contemporary art, they tend to be written at a level which really can be a huge barrier for people. It makes them feel like they don't
almost
understand.
As if they're intended to exclude.
Yes, exactly. You think you go there and you're thinking, I don't even understand what this label says. So clearly I'm either, I don't understand, or some people feel stupid, which is a horrible feeling. I would, that to me is probably the worst feeling I would want anyone to ever feel, is that they're stupid or that they don't understand something. And that to me is not their fault. That's the fault of the space, of the person who curated or who's written that interpretation. So inclusivity to me includes all of that. And it also includes things that are, sometimes people think inclusivity is the moment the person walks in the door, but actually it's much more of a wider look of how do they actually get there, right? So if we're talking about the geographical thing that we mentioned earlier, I wouldn't be concerned at the museum only from the point of view of once they get to my door, then I worry about them. I have to worry about them from before they get through my door, right? How do they get here? Is there public transport for them, for example? Is there cheap public transport? Is there a shuttle bus? Is there some kind of a way in which I can incorporate what they're doing with the ticket so maybe they can see more for less money, promotional things, whatever it might be. But I mean, you have to look at it from a wider perspective and not just from when they get to your door, because the problem is often they can't get to your door. The problem lies somewhere else in the chain, so to speak. So I think that's important sometimes to look at. And I think inclusion in general and being more diverse in what you show and who you show, what kind of artists that are represented, this is also important. And I think for me, that's one area I really want to continue to excel in as an authority. And another is definitely sustainability. I think sustainability is a huge issue. I don't know if you saw that beautiful photo a few days ago of the Sahara Desert with like ice and snow on it. And I thought, that's a beautiful photo, but that's a terrifying photo at the same time. And I think, climate change is a huge concern. I mean, to put it, completely lightly, it's a catastrophe. And I think what we're heading towards, we don't do something, and we don't all play our part, is something really scary. So for me, looking at how the museums can be more sustainable in terms of energy use, in terms of material use, and everything else is something holistically I want to look at, not just from recycling paper to whatever, but from a much more broader perspective, from how we build them and how we plan to keep them energy saving and looking at green solutions, I think. So there's a lot in maybe that area I think I'd like to focus on. And of course, there'll be other things that come in between, as I mentioned from the beginning. The job always suddenly requires you to pivot and do other things. So in between those two major, I think, for me, interests, there'll be other things that will come up, and I'll just have to tackle them as they come, and embrace them as they come.
Well, thank you so much for your versatility and your nimbleness and the fact that you're willing to speak to us. And if anyone is listening to this and wants to learn more about the festival, you can go to burda.ae, and there's a bunch of information about both the panel that Manal was on as well as other ones. And we'll be back in a few weeks with another interview. Thanks, Manal.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Mikey. I really appreciate you having me, and it was great to have this chat.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you at the festival. For more information, go to burda.ae, that is burda.ae. The festival runs from December 19th to the 21st at the Dubai Exhibition Center as part of Expo 2020 Dubai. The festival is organized by the Ministry of Culture and Youth, UAE, and this podcast is powered by Afikra Podcasts. Take care.